On a bright and seemingly ordinary day, a girl selling lemonade with a captivating smile was brutally ambushed by an enraged biker. But the unexpected happened when Cena, emerging as an unlikely hero, stepped in with courage and determination, forever changing the course of that dramatic moment. The first snow of winter fell on Millfield like a secret, transforming the small Michigan town into a landscape of hushed white. Cena stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, watching the flakes swirl in the pre-dawn darkness. At 42, he had returned to his hometown after 15 years away, following his father's unexpected death 3 months ago. The old Victorian house on Maple Street, his childhood home, now belonged to him, along with all its memories and whispers. John sighed, his breath fogging the cold glass. Today marked the deadline to decide whether to sell the house to a developer who wanted to turn the property into modern apartments. The offer was generous, more than enough to solve his financial troubles and return to his life in Boston. Yet something kept him hesitating, some unnameable pull that had strengthened since his return. His phone vibrated on the counter, a text from his daughter, Emma. "Good morning, Dad. Made a decision yet?" At 19, Emma remained in Boston. For college, their relationship strained by years of John's workaholic habits and emotional distance following his divorce. John set the phone down without responding. How could he explain feelings he barely understood himself? The sound of tires crunching on snow drew his attention to the driveway. A faded blue pickup truck had pulled in, and John recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette that emerged. Samantha Hayes, his father's best friend and the town's only carpenter, had been helping with repairs around the house. At 45, with prematurely silver hair and lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled, Sam carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the language of wood and nails better than people. He opened the door before she knocked, finding her stomping snow from her boots, her breath visible in the cold air. "You're here early," he said, stepping back to let her in. Sam removed her worn leather gloves. "Thought you might be up. Today's the day, right?" Her voice carried the slight raspiness that John had found himself listening for when she wasn't around. "It is," he replied, turning back toward the kitchen to hide the conflict in his expression. "Coffee's fresh." As he poured her a cup, John felt the weight of the coming hours pressing down on him. Beyond the practical decision about the house lay deeper questions he'd been avoiding since his return. What was he running from? What was he searching for? And why did it feel like the answers were somehow hidden within these walls that had witnessed his entire childhood and now seemed to be calling him home? John led Sam into the study, his father's sanctuary, where boxes of old photographs and papers still waited to be sorted. The room smelled of leather-bound books and the faint hint of his father's pipe tobacco that lingered even months after his passing. Morning light filtered through the stained glass window his mother had installed years ago, casting colorful patterns across the hardwood floor. "I need to finish cataloging his research papers," John said, gesturing to the stacks on the massive oak desk. His father, Professor James Cena, had been the town's unofficial historian, documenting Millfield's journey from lumber boom to near ghost town to its current rebirth as an artist's haven. Sam set her coffee down and picked up an old photograph from the pile. "Remember this day?" she asked, handing it to him. John's breath caught. The image showed 3 teenagers on the town's old covered bridge, himself at 17, Sam, and his best friend Daniel. They were laughing, arms linked, summer light dappling through the bridge's wooden slats. 3 months after this photo was taken, John had left for college, determined never to return to the suffocating smallness of Millfield. He'd only come back for obligatory holiday visits, keeping his distance from the hometown that had felt too limiting for his ambitions. "I remember," he said softly. "That was the summer before everything changed." Sam nodded, her eyes holding his for a moment before looking away. "Your father kept every article you ever published, you know, had them in a special folder." She gestured toward a leather portfolio on the bookshelf. "He was proud of you, Johnny, even if he didn't always know how to say it." The nickname, one only his father and Sam had ever used, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through him. John turned away, busying himself with organizing papers. We had our differences, he said tightly. He never understood why I needed to leave. Maybe he understood more than you think. Sam's voice was quiet. People can surprise you that way. A knock at the front door interrupted them. Through the window, John could see a sleek black car parked beside Sam's weathered pickup, a stark contrast that seemed to perfectly illustrate his current crossroads. That's probably Richard Kent, he said, straightening his sweater. The developer. Sam's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I'll get started on that loose banister upstairs. Give you some privacy. As she headed for the stairs, tools in hand, John called after her. Sam, what would you do if you were me? She paused, one hand on the carved wooden newel post that his great-grandfather had installed in 1897. I think, she said carefully, that some decisions need to be made with more than just your head. Then she continued upstairs, her footsteps fading into the quiet creaking of the old house. Richard Kent was exactly as John had expected, polished, efficient, and armed with revised paperwork that increased his offer by 15%. The market's only getting hotter in Millfield, he explained, setting out architectural renderings of the proposed development on the kitchen table. These units will sell before they're even built. John studied the images, modern, clean-lined, apartments where his family home now stood. Only the massive oak tree in the backyard would remain as a selling point for the property's historic charm. And what about my father's archives, he asked. The Historical Society can only take so much. Kent's smile didn't waver. We'd be happy to name the development Cena Place in honor of your father, perhaps display some photographs in the lobby. The suggestion felt hollow, reducing his father's lifelong passion to decoration. John found himself staring through the kitchen doorway to where his father's grandfather clock stood in the hallway, its steady ticking marking the passage of time as it had for generations. I need to think about it, he said finally, just until tomorrow. Kent looked disappointed, but recovered quickly. Of course, but remember, John, properties like this are emotional. It's easy to get caught up in sentimentality. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is to let go of the past. He gathered his materials, leaving the contract on the table. Call me when you're ready to sign. After showing him out, John climbed the stairs to the second floor, following the sounds of Sam's work. He found her kneeling by the banister, carefully replacing a spindle that had come loose. How did it go? She asked without looking up from her work. He increased the offer. John leaned against the wall, watching her hands work with practiced precision. And gave me a lecture about sentimentality. Sam chuckled. Sounds about right. Is that what this is? Just sentimentality? Am I being irrational about an old house? Sam set down her tools and stood, dusting off her hands. When your father got sick, he asked me to look after the place until you came home. Not if, until. He believed you'd come back someday. John felt a twist of guilt. He'd been so busy building his life in Boston that his visits home had become increasingly rare. By the time his father was diagnosed with cancer, it had progressed too far too quickly. He'd barely made it back in time to say goodbye. I should have come back sooner, he whispered. Sam shook her head. He understood. James was proud of what you built for yourself. She hesitated. There's something I've been meaning to show you. In the attic. Curiosity piqued. John followed her up the narrow stairs to the attic, a space he'd avoided during his stay. The air was colder here, dust particles dancing in the shafts of light from the dormer windows. Sam led him to an old steamer trunk in the corner. Your dad asked me to make sure you found this when the time was right. John knelt before the trunk, running his fingers over the brass latches. I don't remember this. It belonged to your mother, Sam said softly. James put it up here after. She died. John's mother had passed when he was 12, leaving a void that had never fully healed. His father, lost in his grief, had retreated into his historical research, while John had thrown himself into academics, both finding solace in the worlds of the mind rather than confronting their shared loss. It was a pattern John had unknowingly repeated in his adult life, burying himself in work after his divorce rather than processing the pain. With slightly trembling hands, John opened the trunk. Inside lay carefully preserved treasures, his mother's. Journals, sketchbooks filled with architectural drawings, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Beneath these was a leather portfolio containing detailed plans for renovating their Victorian home, dreams his mother had never lived to realize. "She had so many plans for this place," Sam said quietly. "Your father could never bring himself to look at them after she was gone, but he kept everything." John lifted out one of the journals, opening to a random page. His mother's handwriting flowed across the page. "The beauty of this old house isn't just in its bones, but in how it holds our stories. Every creak in the floorboards, every nick in the banister tells part of our family's journey. I want to honor that past, while creating spaces for new memories to form. That's what makes a house truly timeless." The word struck John with unexpected force. He'd spent so many years focused on moving forward, on creating a successful future, that he'd disconnected from his past. Perhaps that was why he felt so unmoored now. He had roots he'd never fully acknowledged. As the snow continued to fall outside, John spent hours immersed in his mother's writings and drawings. Sam worked quietly around the house, giving him space while remaining a reassuring presence. Through his mother's words, John began to see the house through new eyes, not as an anchor tying him to a place he'd outgrown, but as a living testament to generations of hopes, dreams, and love. When evening came, Sam built a fire in the living room hearth, and John made them a simple dinner. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where his family had shared countless meals, where homework had been completed, and where his father had spread out his research late into the night. "I've been thinking about staying," John said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. Sam looked up, a flicker of something crossing her face. "In Millfield?" Yes. The idea had been forming throughout the day, pieces falling into place. "I could work remotely. My company's been moving toward that anyway since the pandemic. And Emma could visit during breaks. She's never really spent time here." "What about Boston, your life there?" John considered this. "My apartment is just a place to sleep between workdays. After the divorce, I never really made it a home." He traced the wood grain of the table with his finger. "When my father died, I felt untethered, like I'd been floating for years without realizing it." Sam was quiet for a moment. "Staying doesn't mean giving up on everything you've built, Johnny. It could mean building something new on a foundation that's already there." As night fell, the snow outside thickened, the wind picking up to create ghostly swirls that danced past the windows. John stood at the glass doors leading to the back porch, watching the oak tree's branches sway under their white burden. "Storm's getting worse," Sam said, coming to stand beside him. "I should head out before the roads get bad." John turned to her, making a decision. "Stay, please. There's something I want to show you in the morning." Dawn broke clear and brilliant. After the storm, sunlight turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. John woke early, a sense of purpose carrying him downstairs before the sun had fully risen. He built a fire, made coffee, and spread his mother's renovation plans across the dining room table alongside his own hastily sketched additions. When Sam came downstairs, still tousled from sleep in the guest room, she found him surrounded by papers, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead, eyes bright with excitement. "I've been up half the night," he said without preamble. "Look at this." Sam accepted the coffee he handed her and studied the plans. "These are your mother's designs, but you've modified them." John nodded eagerly. "I think this is why I couldn't sign those papers. My mother saw the potential in this place, not just as a home, but as something more." He pointed to his sketches. "The main floor could be converted into a small historical museum featuring my father's archives. The carriage house could become a research center or community space." "And upstairs?" Sam asked. "Still a home, my home." The words felt right as he spoke them. "And there's more. I found this in my father's desk last night." He handed her a sealed envelope addressed to him in his father's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a letter written in the final weeks of his life, along with documents showing that he had established a foundation in his mother's name, funded by his life insurance and investments, dedicated to historical preservation in Millfield. "He appointed me as director," John said, voice thick with emotion. "He knew Somehow he knew I would come back, that I would need purpose. Sam read through the letter, her expression softening. Your father was always playing the long game, even at the end. Outside, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Through the window, John could see Richard Kent emerging from his vehicle, briefcase in hand, coming to collect his decision and, presumably, his signature. I need to talk to him, he said, gathering his courage. Sam reached out, her hand covering his briefly. Whatever you decide, Johnny, I'm here. The simple promise, free of pressure or expectation, filled him with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. John straightened his shoulders and went to open the door. Kent greeted him with a confident smile that faltered slightly at his expression. Good. Morning, John. Beautiful day after the storm. I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I have, he replied, inviting him inside but not offering to take his coat. And I'm afraid I can't accept it. Kent's practiced composure slipped momentarily. Perhaps we should discuss this further. I understand your attachment to the property, but it's not just attachment, John interrupted, leading him into the dining room where his plans were displayed. This house has a different future ahead of it. He outlined his vision for the Cena Historical Center and Museum, watching Kent's expression shift from confusion to calculation. That's an ambitious project, Kent said finally. But surely you understand the financial realities. The renovation costs alone would be substantial, not to mention ongoing maintenance and staffing. I understand the challenges, John replied calmly, but I also have resources you don't know about, including a foundation specifically established for this purpose. Kent studied him for a long moment, seeming to recognize the resolve in his stance. Well, he said finally, snapping his briefcase closed, I can see your mind is made up. Should your plans fall through, my offer stands for the next 60 days. After he left, John found Sam in the study, carefully organizing his father's research notes. She looked up as he entered, a question in her eyes. It's done, he said, leaning against the doorframe. I'm staying. Sam nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. Never doubted it for a minute. Liar, he teased, feeling lighter than he had in months, perhaps years. She set down the papers and crossed to him. Not about the important things. The unspoken history between them hung in the air. The summer before he left for college, when their friendship had teetered on the edge of something more, the paths that had diverged, the years that had passed, with only peripheral awareness of each other's lives. Sam, he began, when I left Millfield, you did what you needed to do, she finished for him. We all have our journeys, Johnny. And now my journey has brought me back, he said softly. She reached out, hesitantly brushing a strand of hair from his face, her fingers lingering for a moment against his cheek. Welcome home. The simple touch and words broke something open inside him, years of carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. John stepped forward into her embrace, allowing himself to feel the full weight of returning, the grief for his father, the reconnection with his past, and the tentative hope for a future he hadn't imagined possible. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, its light streaming through the stained glass window to paint the room in colors that seemed to pulse with new life. In that moment of clarity, John finally understood what had been holding him in Millfield. It wasn't just the house with its history and memories, it was the possibility of healing, of creating a life that honored both his past and his future, that embraced both roots and wings. Spring came to Millfield in a riot of green, transforming the landscape from winter's monochrome to a canvas of vibrant color. John stood on the back porch of the Cena house, his house, watching workers carefully installing the new sign at the entrance to the property, the Cena Center for Local History and Preservation. 6 months had passed since his decision to stay, months filled with planning, phone calls, permit applications, and more coffee than any person should reasonably consume. The renovation of the main floor was nearly complete, showcasing his father's archives in beautiful custom-built display cases that Sam had crafted by hand. Behind him, the sound of the screen door opening announced Emma's arrival. His daughter had been skeptical about John's decision at first, but had gradually warmed to the idea during her weekend visits from college. "Dad, the caterers are asking where to set up for the opening reception," Emma said, stepping beside him. John smiled, noting the ease in his daughter's posture that hadn't been there months ago. Their relationship had begun healing in unexpected ways as they worked together on the center. Emma's marketing studies proving invaluable for promoting the new venture. "The garden, I think," John replied. "Your grandfather would have liked that." Emma nodded, leaning against the porch railing. "I wish I'd known him better." "Me too," John said softly. "But in a way, I've gotten to know him more deeply through his work than I did when he was alive. Maybe that's part of his legacy, too." From inside came the sounds of final preparations, volunteers arranging exhibits, Sam directing the installation of the last display cases, the town's mayor practicing her speech for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The house hummed with activity and purpose, just as John's mother had envisioned in her journals. Sam emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Everything's set inside," she said, coming to stand on John's other side. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, both of them mindful of the history they carried and the future they were building. "It's really happening," John said, looking between Sam and Emma, feeling a surge of gratitude for this unexpected new chapter in his life. Sam slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. "Did you ever imagine when you came back for your father's funeral that this is where you'd end up?" John shook his head. "Never. I thought I was just closing one chapter. I didn't realize I was opening another." Emma glanced at their linked hands and smiled, a small acknowledgement of her growing acceptance of Sam's place in their lives. "I should go help inside," she said, giving John's shoulder a quick squeeze before heading back to the house. Alone on the porch, John turned to Sam. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping me see what was right in front of me." She smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling. "You always knew, Johnny. You just needed time to remember." As they stood together in the spring sunshine, John felt the echoes of the past merging with the promise of the future. The weight he had carried for so long, the grief, the regret, the sense of disconnection, had transformed into something else. Something lighter yet more substantial, a life anchored in both memory and possibility. The old Victorian house stood behind them, no longer just a repository of the past, but a bridge to the future, its rooms filled once again with conversation, laughter, and purpose. John had returned to Millfield thinking he was simply fulfilling an obligation, never expecting to find himself in the process. Some journeys, he now understood, weren't about leaving or arriving, but about recognizing when you were exactly where you needed to be.